September 8, 1941. At precisely 6:55 in the evening, the last road connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union was cut by advancing German forces. At that moment, a city of nearly 3 million people, one of the great cultural capitals of European civilization, the birthplace of the Russian Revolution, the city that Peter the Great had built from the swamps of the Neva Delta as a window onto the world, became a prison. The siege that followed would last 872 days. It would kill more civilians than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. It would produce suffering on a scale that even the Eastern Front, that vast, grinding theater of industrialized violence, had rarely seen. It would test the absolute limits of what human beings can endure and still remain human. And it would end, finally, in January 1944, not with surrender but with Soviet guns pushing the Germans back from a city that had refused, through everything, to fall. This is the story of the Siege of Leningrad, the longest, deadliest siege in modern history. The 900 days that consumed a generation and left a mark on the Russian soul that has never fully healed. To understand what Leningrad meant, to the Soviet Union, to the German invaders, to the people who lived and died inside its siege lines, you have to understand what kind of city it was. Not just its strategic importance, though that was real. Not just its size, though 3 million people made it the fourth largest city in Europe. But its identity, its meaning, what it represented in the imagination of the people who loved it and the people who wanted to destroy it. Peter the Great began building his city in 1703, on the marshy delta of the Neva River where it meets the Gulf of Finland. The site was almost perfectly unsuitable for a major city, waterlogged, prone to flooding, brutally cold in winter, separated from the Russian heartland by vast distances of forest and swamp. Peter chose it anyway, because it was a window onto the world. It faced west, toward Europe, toward the civilizations that Peter was determined his backward, isolated country would learn from, compete with, and eventually surpass. He built his city on the bones of the serfs who died in their thousands constructing it, and he built it to be magnificent. What emerged over the following 2 centuries was one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The Winter Palace, the Hermitage, the Nevsky Prospect with its soaring neoclassical facades, the golden spire of the Admiralty catching the light over the Neva, the bridges, the canals, the endless summer evenings when the sun barely set and the city glowed in the white nights that were one of its most distinctive and beloved features. The city had been called St. Petersburg until the First World War, when its German-sounding name was changed to the more Russian Petrograd. After Lenin's death in 1924, it was renamed Leningrad, the city of Lenin, in honor of the man whose revolution had been launched from its streets. But Leningraders, regardless of what they called their city officially, knew it as something older and deeper than any political name. They knew it as the place where Pushkin had ridden and dueled and died. Where Dostoevsky had wandered the streets putting his tormented characters together from the faces of the people he passed. Where the composer Shostakovich had been born and educated and from which he would be evacuated in September 1941, but not before completing the first 3 movements of the symphony that would become the defining musical document of the siege. The city had a cultural weight, a density of history and art and intellectual life, that made it unlike any other place in the Soviet Union, more European than Russian in its architecture and atmosphere, more cosmopolitan than the vast interior cities, more conscious of itself as a place of civilization. This was precisely why Hitler wanted it erased. Hitler's hatred of Leningrad went beyond the purely military. He wanted to destroy it not just as a strategic objective but as a symbol, to demonstrate that the Soviet experiment, The Bolshevik revolution that had begun in this city's streets was being physically obliterated along with its ideological pretensions. He did not want Leningrad captured and occupied. He wanted it annihilated. His directive of September 1941, issued as German forces were closing the ring around the city, was explicit. Leningrad was to be surrounded and starved into submission. When the population could no longer resist, the city was to be razed. Not a stone was to be left standing. The population, all of it, men, women, children, was to be dispersed or killed. Leningrad was to cease to exist. This was not a military objective. It was a declaration of exterminatory intent against one of the great cities of human civilization. And it came very close to being carried out. The German advance in the summer of 1941 had been a catastrophe for the Soviet Union on a scale that is almost impossible to absorb. In the first 6 weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht advanced further and destroyed more enemy forces than any army in modern history. By the time the front lines stabilized in the autumn, the Germans had captured or killed more than 3 million Soviet soldiers, had occupied territory containing a third of the Soviet Union's population and more than half of its industrial capacity, and had brought 2 of the 3 largest Soviet cities, Leningrad in the northwest and Kiev in the southwest, under direct military threat. The fall of Kiev in September 1941, in the largest encirclement battle in the history of warfare, had seen more than 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured. The road to Moscow seemed open, and in the northwest, Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb had pushed to within striking distance of Leningrad, cutting the last land route into the city on September 8 and leaving only the waters of Lake Ladoga, and the sky above it, as potential lifelines. The commander of the Leningrad front was changed repeatedly in those desperate days. The first commander, Kliment Voroshilov, was a crony of Stalin's from the Civil War era, a man whose primary qualification for military command was his political loyalty rather than his military ability. He was replaced, in the most desperate week of the siege's opening days, by the man who more than anyone else would come to be associated with Leningrad's survival, Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov arrived in Leningrad on September 10, 1941, and immediately communicated the message that would characterize his brief tenure in command: there would be no retreat. None. Any commander who ordered a withdrawal without explicit permission would be shot. Any soldier who abandoned his position would be shot. The city would be held regardless of cost, because the alternative, the city falling to an enemy that had explicitly stated its intention to destroy it and kill its population, was a cost that no mathematical calculation of military losses could outweigh. Zhukov was not a gentle man. His methods were brutal even by the standards of the Red Army's brutal disciplinary culture. But he was also a military genius, and in the 2 weeks he spent commanding the Leningrad front, he stabilized a situation that had been on the verge of total collapse. The German advance was stopped. Not comfortably, not with any margin to spare, but stopped. The siege lines were established. And then Zhukov was transferred to Moscow, where another crisis demanded his presence, leaving Leningrad to a different kind of war: the long, grinding, catastrophic ordeal of the blockade. The mathematics of the Leningrad blockade were stark and terrible from the very beginning. The city, before the siege, had maintained approximately 1 month's worth of food reserves. It had a population of nearly 3 million people. Simple arithmetic showed that without resupply, the city would begin to starve within weeks. The Soviet authorities knew this. They began rationing almost immediately after the blockade began, and the rations they set were already below subsistence level, the amount of food needed to maintain a human body's basic functions. For workers in the most essential war industries, the daily bread ration in September 1941 was 600 grams, about 21 ounces. For office workers, it was 400 grams. For dependents, the elderly, children, people not employed in war production, it was 200 grams. These numbers would fall further, much further, as the autumn wore on and it became clear that the city could not be resupplied by land. The authorities struggled to bring in supplies by air and by barge across Lake Ladoga, the enormous lake that lay to the east of the city, and that was the only route not controlled by German forces. The air route was limited by the number of aircraft available and by German fighters that attacked the transport planes. The barge route across Lake Ladoga was exposed to German artillery and air attack and was limited by the number of barges and the shallow depths of certain sections of the lake. Neither route came close to supplying the city's needs. By November 1941, the daily bread ration for dependents had fallen to 125 grams, less than 2.5 ounces. This was not a ration that sustained life. It was a ration that delayed death. And the bread itself was not bread in any normal sense. It was a mixture of whatever grain could be found, extended with sawdust, cellulose, wallpaper paste, and other substances that provided bulk without nutrition. The official ration of 125 grams was sometimes in practice less, because the baking process was imprecise, because corruption took its share, because the distribution system was chaotic. People ate whatever could be eaten. They stripped wallpaper from the walls and boiled it to extract the paste. They rendered leather belts and boots into a kind of gelatinous soup. They caught and ate every cat, dog, rat, and pigeon in the city, a process that took only weeks, after which these animals simply ceased to exist within the siege lines. They collected oil from the surface of bombed-out roads. They ate carpenter's glue, which contained animal products that provided some minimal nutritional value. They ate clay. Diarrhea Lazar, a Leningrad schoolteacher who kept a diary throughout the siege, recorded with meticulous and heartbreaking precision the daily diminishment of life in her apartment building. October 14th. Used the last of the lard today. Made soup from leather scraps and a handful of oats. My neighbor Vera came to visit. She has lost so much weight I almost did not recognize her. November 3rd. There is nothing left in the apartment that can be eaten. I have begun to trade my books for food, but there is little food to trade for. The market prices are impossible. November 20th. My son did not come home from work today. I do not know where he is. It is too cold to go and look. The cold was the second great killer, working alongside hunger with a systematic thoroughness that overwhelmed the city's ability to cope. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was unusually severe even by Leningrad standards. Temperatures dropped to -30 and below, and the city's heating system, which depended on fuel deliveries that were not arriving, failed almost completely. People burned their furniture. They burned their books. They burned the wooden floors and the wooden window frames and the wooden staircases of their apartment buildings. Eventually, there was nothing left to burn, and the cold moved in. In apartments across the city, families gathered in a single room around whatever small heat source they had managed to create. A tiny iron stove called a burzuika, fired with anything combustible, and tried to maintain a pocket of survivable temperature in rooms where the walls were covered in ice and the water in the pipes had long since frozen. People wore everything they owned, layering coat over coat, sleeping fully dressed, moving as little as possible to conserve the calories they could not replace. The bodies began to appear in the streets in November and multiplied through December. People who had ventured out and collapsed. People who had died in their apartments and been carried out by relatives too weak themselves to do more than lay the body in the snow outside the door. The dead could not be buried. The ground was frozen solid, impenetrable to shovel or pickaxe, and the living did not have the strength for the effort of digging even if they had had the tools. At the height of the famine, in January and February 1942, approximately 100,000 people were dying in Leningrad every month. Some estimates put the figure higher. The official records were kept imperfectly and were subsequently manipulated by Soviet authorities anxious to control the historical narrative of the siege, and the true death toll remains disputed, but most historians now accept a figure of somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million civilian deaths from starvation and cold during the siege, with the vast majority concentrated in the terrible winter of 1941 to 1942. To put that in perspective, more people died in Leningrad in the winter of 1941 to 1942 than the United States lost in the entire Second World War. More people died in this single city in these few months than in the combined Allied and German casualties on the Western Front for the entire war. And yet the city did not surrender. This fact, so extraordinary that it has the quality of miracle even to secular historians, requires explanation. The Soviet state certainly played a role. The party organization in Leningrad maintained control throughout the siege, and the threat of the NKVD's consequences for defeatism or collaboration was real and credible. But enforcement mechanisms alone cannot explain why a city of starving, freezing, dying civilians continued to function, continued to produce tanks and artillery shells in its factories, continued to mount military operations against the besieging forces. Part of the explanation is the Germans themselves. The Leningraders knew, from the behavior of the Wehrmacht in other occupied territories and from the explicit statements of German policy regarding the city, that surrender was not a real option. Opening the gates of Leningrad would not end the starvation, it would exchange one form of death for another, almost certainly worse. The Germans had stated their intention to destroy the city and kill or disperse its population. Surrender was not rescue. It was simply a different route to the same end. Part of the explanation is the particular culture of Leningrad itself. The city had a tradition of intellectual and artistic life that created, even in extremity, a kind of community of meaning, a shared sense that what was being defended was not just territory but civilization itself. Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, composed partly inside the siege and broadcast on Leningrad radio in August 1942, was more than propaganda. It was a genuine act of cultural defiance, a statement that the city's soul was alive, that its cultural life continued even in the midst of its physical destruction. And part of the explanation is simply that human beings, when they have no other option, survive. The lifeline that saved Leningrad, barely, inadequately, but saved it nonetheless, was a route that existed in a form that would have seemed absurd under any other circumstances, a road across a frozen lake. Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe, lay to the east of Leningrad. Its western shore was inside the German encirclement, its eastern shore was in Soviet-held territory. For most of the year, the lake was navigable water, barges could cross it, carrying supplies into the city. But in the autumn and early winter of 1941, before the ice was thick enough to support heavy transport, there was a period of several weeks when neither barges nor trucks could cross. The ice was too thin for trucks, too thick for boats. During those weeks, the city was almost completely cut off, and the death rate rose to its highest levels. When the ice finally thickened enough to support weight, the engineers calculated that a minimum of 8 inches was required for a light vehicle, more for a loaded truck. The road of life opened. The first convoys of horses and sleds crossed in November 1941, bringing back a trickle of food. As the ice thickened, trucks began making the crossing, their headlights blacked out to avoid German air attack, their doors held open so that drivers could bail out if the ice cracked beneath them. The crossing was approximately 20 miles across open ice. In the darkness, in temperatures of -30 and below, with German aircraft hunting anything that moved on the lake's surface and with the ice itself cracking and shifting under the weight of the convoys, it was one of the most dangerous regular supply operations of the entire war. Hundreds of vehicles went through the ice, some because the ice was thinner than the engineers had calculated, some because German bombs or artillery shells weakened it, some simply because the structural stresses of continuous heavy use caused fractures that spread without warning. Drivers had seconds to escape before their vehicles vanished into the black water beneath. Those who drove the road of life were, disproportionately, women. So many men had been called to the front that the logistics organizations that ran the supply route relied heavily on female drivers, many of them barely trained, none of them experienced in the specific terrors of driving a loaded truck across a frozen lake in the dark with enemy aircraft overhead. They drove anyway. The convoys ran day and night, weather permitting, and the food they brought in, always insufficient, never enough to fully feed the city, but enough to prevent the complete starvation that Hitler had counted on, was the difference between the death of Leningrad and its survival. The road of life also carried people out. Civilians, children first, then the elderly and the sick, then essential workers whose skills were needed elsewhere, were evacuated across the lake in the same trucks that brought food in. The evacuations were often chaotic and always difficult. People who had been starving for months were sometimes too weak to survive the crossing, dying in the trucks from the cold and exhaustion of the journey. But hundreds of thousands of people were evacuated over the course of the siege, reducing the population that had to be fed and freeing up the minimal food supplies for those who remained. The German Air Force attempted systematically to interdict the road of life, bombing the convoys and the supply depots on the eastern shore. Soviet fighter cover was provided, but was insufficient to stop the attacks entirely. The lake's surface, cratered by bombs and stained with oil from sunken vehicles, became a landscape of extraordinary desolation, a road across death that was also a road away from it. When spring came and the ice melted, the road of life closed and the barge route reopened. When the following winter froze the lake again, the ice road reopened. This cycle continued for the duration of the siege, each winter a new calculation of ice thickness and carrying capacity and German air activity, each crossing a new individual act of courage by the people who drove it. There is a stretch of road on the eastern shore of Lake Ladoga, approaching the point where the ice road began, that is lined with memorials to the people who drove it. Rusted vehicles, recovered from the lake bottom. Plaques recording names. Photographs of young women at the wheels of trucks. The road of life is remembered in Russia with a reverence that goes beyond ordinary historical commemoration. It is understood as the act that saved the city, the lifeline that kept the body of Leningrad alive while its spirit refused to die. Simultaneously with the effort to supply the city across the lake, Soviet military planners were working on operations to break the siege entirely. The first attempts, in the winter of 1941 to 1942, failed at tremendous cost. The Red Army was still in the early stages of learning how to conduct large-scale offensive operations, and the German defenses around Leningrad were formidable. Operation Spark, launched in January 1943, succeeded in opening a narrow land corridor to the city, only 8 miles wide, under constant German fire, but a land connection nonetheless. The railway built along this corridor began bringing supplies directly into the city, supplementing the lake route and beginning the gradual improvement in conditions that would allow Leningrad's population to survive the remaining year of the siege. Inside the city, life adapted to siege conditions in ways that would be difficult to imagine without the testimony of those who lived through it. The theaters reopened, with performers who were visibly starving, who sometimes fainted on stage from weakness, but who continued to perform because the performances were a statement of survival. The public libraries stayed open, though the librarians were dying of hunger and the heating had long since failed. Schools operated intermittently, though children too weak to walk had to be carried to class. The radio was perhaps the most important institution in the siege. Leningrad radio broadcast continuously music, news, readings from literature, official announcements, the simple, regular beat of a metronome during the intervals between programs that told listeners the city's heart was still beating. When the broadcast stopped, people knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. The metronome became one of the defining sounds of the siege, a rhythmic reassurance in the dark and the cold that the city was still alive. History remembers the Siege of Leningrad through numbers: 872 days, 800,000 dead, 125 grams of bread, 100,000 dying every month. These numbers are important. They communicate the scale of the catastrophe in ways that words alone cannot fully capture. But they are also, in their abstraction, a kind of distancing mechanism, a way of comprehending the siege that keeps its human reality at arm's length. The human reality was this: every one of those numbers was a person. Every death was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's beloved. The siege was experienced not as a statistic but as a sequence of individual losses, each one reshaping the lives of the people who survived it, until the survivors found themselves living in a city populated largely by ghosts. Lena Mukina was 15 years old when the siege began. She had been keeping a diary since before the war, the ordinary diary of an ordinary teenager, full of school and friendships and the small dramas of adolescent life. After September 8, 1941, the diary became something else entirely, a daily record of a world dissolving. She wrote about food obsessively, as everyone in the siege wrote about food: what she had eaten, what she hoped to eat, the impossible luxury of pre-war meals that occupied her dreams. She wrote about the friends and neighbors who were dying around her, one by one, with a matter-of-fact precision that was more devastating than any dramatic description. Tamara's mother died yesterday. She was a kind woman. Tamara does not know yet that her mother is dead. She is in the hospital. The old professor from the third floor was taken away today. Someone said he had been eating leather. Everyone eats leather. Mukina survived the siege. She was evacuated in 1942 and lived until 1991. Her diary, published decades after the war, became one of the most important primary sources for understanding what the siege felt like from the inside, not from the perspective of military commanders or political officials, but from the perspective of an ordinary person trying to stay alive and make sense of what was happening around her. Daniil Granin, a writer who survived the siege and later collaborated on a multi-volume oral history of it called The Blockade Book, spent decades after the war collecting the testimonies of survivors. What he found, consistently, across hundreds of individual accounts, was a quality that he described as the transformation of normal human responses under extreme conditions. People who had been generous became calculating about food. People who had been patient became unable to tolerate any delay in the distribution of rations. People who had been sociable became solitary, hoarding their energy, unable to spare the physical resources that conversation and social interaction required. And yet there were also accounts of extraordinary generosity. People who shared their last food with strangers. People who risked their lives to carry wounded neighbors out of bombed buildings. A factory worker who, seeing a child collapsed in the street, carried her to a shelter and then went back to his shift because the artillery shells being made on that shift might help break the siege and save the child from future suffering. These acts of generosity existed alongside the cruelty and the desperation and the breakdown of normal social behavior. They were not the dominant note, but they were real, and they matter. The children of the siege require particular acknowledgement. There were approximately 400,000 children in Leningrad when the blockade began. Many were evacuated during the first weeks, before the ring closed completely. But hundreds of thousands remained, and their experience of the siege was both the same as the adults around them and profoundly different. Children starved alongside their parents. They froze alongside their parents. They helped carry water from the river when the pipes froze, dragging sleds across the ice for miles to the Neva because the closest source of water was the river. They queued for bread rations in temperatures of -30, sometimes for hours, sometimes for nothing when the rations ran out. Some of them worked in the factories. There are accounts of 12 and 13-year-old children standing on wooden crates to reach the machines they were operating, because the adult workers who should have been at those machines were dead or evacuated. Their drawings, preserved in the archives and published in the years since the siege, are among the most disturbing documents of the entire war. Children draw what they know. And what these children knew was queues for bread and bomb craters in the streets and the shapes of people dying in the snow. One child drew a picture of her apartment building with the caption, "This is where we live. Most of the people here are dead now." She was 8 years old. The cultural life of the siege deserves more than a passing mention, because it was not peripheral to the experience of survival, it was central to it. The decision by the Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra to continue performing, by the theaters to continue staging productions, by writers and poets to continue writing, was a statement of defiance that had concrete effects on the morale of the city's defenders and surviving civilians. Dmitri Shostakovich began composing his Seventh Symphony in July 1941, as the German invasion was transforming the entire Soviet Union. He completed the first 3 movements inside Leningrad before being evacuated in October, and finished the symphony in Kuibyshev in December. The premiere, in March 1942, was broadcast to the world and was understood everywhere as a statement about the survival of civilization under barbaric assault. But it was the performance inside Leningrad itself that has become legendary. On August 9, 1942, the Leningrad Philharmonic performed the Seventh Symphony in the Grand Philharmonia Hall. The hall was partially damaged. The orchestra had been reinforced with musicians brought back from the front and in some cases from near starvation, because so many of the regular musicians had died. To ensure that German artillery did not disrupt the performance, the Soviet military launched a counter-battery operation during the concert, silencing the German guns for its duration. Loudspeakers mounted on the city's buildings and on the front lines broadcast the symphony not just to Leningrad's civilians but to the German soldiers in their positions outside the city. What the German soldiers made of it, if they heard it, if they listened, if it meant anything to them through the fog of war and ideology and years of fighting, we cannot know. But the Leningraders who heard it, in that battered hall, surrounded by the evidence of a city dying but not dead, heard something that went beyond music. They heard proof that what they were defending was still worth defending. By the end of 1943, the strategic situation on the Eastern Front had transformed beyond recognition. The catastrophic German defeat at Kursk in July and August had permanently ended the Wehrmacht's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations in the East. The Red Army, equipped and supplied on a scale that had been inconceivable in the desperate days of 1941, was conducting a series of massive offensive operations that were pushing German forces westward along the entire length of the front. In the north, Soviet forces had been building up for a major operation to finally lift the Siege of Leningrad. Operation Neva II, planned through the autumn of 1943, aimed to destroy the German Army Group North's siege lines entirely, not just to open a narrow corridor, as Operation Spark had done in January 1943, but to push the Germans far enough west that Leningrad would be beyond artillery range and its connection to the rest of the Soviet Union would be secure. The operation was launched on January 14, 1944. Two Soviet fronts, the Leningrad Front and the Volkhov Front, attacked simultaneously from different directions, striking the German siege lines with an overwhelming concentration of artillery and armor that the exhausted, outnumbered German forces could not withstand. The fighting was ferocious. The Germans had spent 2.5 years building their defensive positions and were not going to abandon them without resistance. But the Soviet offensive had the momentum that the Red Army, by January 1944, knew how to sustain. The city of Pushkin, formerly Tsarskoye Selo, fell on January 24. Novgorod fell on January 20. The German siege lines, which had been maintained with such terrible cost for so long, began to crumble as Soviet forces found gaps and poured through them, threatening the flanks and rear of units that had held their positions for years. On January 27, 1944, 872 days after the last land route into the city was cut, Leningrad was declared fully liberated. Stalin issued an order for a salute of 324 guns to be fired from the city itself, rather than from Moscow as was the usual practice. 24 salvos lit up the Leningrad sky in celebration, a sky that had been filled, for so long, with the light of German shells and German bombs. The reaction of the city's surviving population to the lifting of the siege is described in accounts that range from wild celebration to something quieter and more complicated. There was joy, certainly, the relief of a people who had endured the unendurable and had survived it. But there was also grief, and exhaustion, and the particular disorientation of people who had been living under extreme threat for so long that its removal felt, at first, almost unreal. Many survivors described feeling, in the immediate aftermath of liberation, not elation but emptiness, a numbness that was the aftermath of years of sustained terror and deprivation. The count of the dead was the first and most terrible reckoning. The official Soviet figures, revised repeatedly over the decades as more documents became available and as the political environment changed, settled eventually at around 800,000 civilian deaths during the siege. Independent scholars and Russian historians working with the archives after the Soviet Union's collapse have suggested higher numbers. Some estimates reach 1.2 million. The true figure is probably unknowable, because the records were imperfectly kept during the siege, because many people died without any official documentation of their deaths, and because the Soviet government had political reasons to present specific figures that served its narrative purposes. What is known is that Leningrad lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of its entire pre-war population to the siege. The demographic wound was severe and lasting. There was a generation of Leningraders who had no grandparents, because the elderly had died first and in the greatest proportions. There was a generation of children who had grown up without enough to eat, whose physical and psychological development had been marked by years of deprivation in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The physical city had survived better than its population. The great buildings, the Winter Palace, the Hermitage, the Admiralty, the churches and palaces of the Neva embankment, had been damaged but not destroyed. The Hermitage's priceless art collections had been evacuated before the siege began, loaded onto trains and sent east to Sverdlovsk, and they had survived. The buildings themselves, though scarred by shells and bombs, remained structurally intact for the most part. The Germans had bombarded the city throughout the siege, but they had not been able to carry out their intention of razing it to the ground. The rebuilding of Leningrad began almost immediately after liberation, with the same collective determination that had characterized the city's resistance. Workers who had spent 2 years surviving on starvation rations began clearing rubble and repairing buildings, working with an intensity that visitors from outside the city found remarkable and that Leningraders themselves understood as a statement. The city that Hitler had tried to erase would be rebuilt, and it would be rebuilt exactly as it had been, not just as a matter of practical need but as a declaration that the attempt at annihilation had failed. The memory of the siege became, in the decades after the war, one of the most powerful and contested elements of Soviet and Russian national identity. The Soviet government, under Stalin and his successors, controlled the narrative carefully. The full scale of civilian deaths was not publicly acknowledged for decades. Testimonies that reflected unfavorably on Soviet leadership, accounts of corruption in the food distribution, of NKVD repression of people who expressed defeatism or criticized the authorities, of the social breakdown and the desperate measures people had taken to survive, were suppressed or censored. Daniil Granin and his company author Ales Adamovich, working on the blockade book in the late 1970s and early 1980s, found themselves in direct conflict with the Soviet censorship apparatus over their insistence on including testimonies that told the full, unvarnished truth of what people had experienced. The book, in its complete form, was not published in the Soviet Union until the glasnost era of the mid-1980s. It was a reminder that the Siege of Leningrad had been not just a historical event but a political one, that the meaning of what had happened there was contested, and that the contest was not over. In the years since the Soviet Union's collapse, the history of the siege has been reopened and re-examined with a thoroughness that was impossible in the Soviet era. The archives have been partially declassified. Survivor testimonies that were suppressed have been published. Scholarly work has revised upward the estimates of civilian deaths, has documented the extent of corruption and social breakdown, has examined the decisions made by Soviet leaders, including Stalin himself, in ways that the official Soviet history never permitted. What has emerged is a more complicated and more human picture than the heroic narrative that official Soviet history presented. The Siege of Leningrad was a catastrophe caused in large part by decisions made at the highest levels of the Soviet state, by the military unpreparedness that allowed the Germans to advance so far in the summer of 1941, by the intelligence failures that left the Red Army unprepared for Barbarossa, by Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s that had gutted the military of its most experienced leadership. The people of Leningrad suffered not just because of German brutality but because of Soviet failures, and acknowledging this complexity does not diminish the courage of the city's defenders. It makes their achievement, in surviving what they survived, all the more extraordinary. The city is called St. Petersburg again now. The name Leningrad was voted out of use in 1991, in a referendum that took place as the Soviet Union itself was dissolving. The decision was controversial. Many survivors of the siege felt that changing the name was an erasure of their sacrifice, a renaming of the place where they had endured and lost and survived. The debate over the name has never been entirely settled, and many Russians, particularly those of the wartime generation, continued to call it Leningrad until the end of their lives. But whatever it is called, the city remembers. Every January 27th, on the anniversary of the lifting of the siege, The city marks the occasion with ceremonies that have continued without interruption since 1944. The survivors, their numbers dwindling each year until now there are almost none left, gather at the Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery where 420,000 siege victims are buried in mass graves, marked by simple mounds of earth, the individual identities of the dead lost in the mass catastrophe of the siege. The eternal flame burns. The names are read. The city that refused to fall pays its respects to the people who died so that it might survive. Leningrad. 900 days. More than 800,000 dead. A city that was supposed to be erased from the face of the earth, that fought and starved and froze and kept fighting, that refused to surrender to the most powerful military force in Europe, that survived. Not comfortably, not without terrible cost, but survived, and stands today as a testament to what human beings can endure when they have no other choice. The siege that lasted 900 days. The city that would not die.